forward now. Thanks for reminding me. I appreciate that. So one of the theoretical approaches that's pursued by Cohen in The Third Night, referring to the Julia incident, I can't remember which character brought that up. I think it was Cohen, but that's fictional, right? So that's actually based on a novel, I think, that was made into a TV movie, actually, in the 1970s. So no one was doing brain transplants, just in case anyone thought that that was actually happening. Although I think the attempt has been made in different instances, albeit not exactly successfully. Okay, so we've got our first presentation today, led by Noel and Amanda. But before we also have to work a little bit through John Locke's theory. So I just have a few more slides to talk about. And so I'll do that before turning to you all for the presentation. But first, I'd like to put you guys into some small groups in the breakout rooms to talk about any or all, as the case may be, any or all of the prompts for this week. And you might even, in your conversation, if it leads that way, go beyond the specificity of the prompts and talk about other things that might have struck you as interesting or important in the dialogue. And then we'll bring it back to the bigger group and talk about that a little bit. And then we'll get back into the discussion of Locke's theory. And then we'll turn to the presenters for the day. So does that sound good? Any questions or concerns or comments before I make the breakout rooms? All right, cool. So I'm going to put those together now.
Just a little gibberish. I wonder if they when they did a brain transplant, they did like a spinal cord transplant as well. If they can have some success, just take the whole vertebrae and spinal column.
Wow. I just had an image of someone's central nervous system being like,
yeah, you need the wiring harness with the ECU, so it makes sense.
Right, yeah. All right, so I'm going to make 5 breakout rooms and each will have 4 participants. So it looks like we've got a good number in here. I think maybe 7 or 8 students are missing right now. But yeah, so I'll go ahead and put you into the rooms. And so, well, actually, it might be helpful if before I do that, if I just share the screen so that we have some clarity together. We're on the same page with respect to the prompts. So the internet's pretty slow. We're just trying to get there right now. Okay, so let me share the screen real quick. And so these are the prompts for week 2 on Moodle. So the first prompt, who are you? So this really is a question about those potential answers to the question of personal identity. And we'll see as we go forward in the weeks to follow, the weeks to come, that there are perhaps innumerable options in terms of responding to this difficult philosophical question. So who are you? When you use the pronoun I, to what exactly are you referring? Weyrob would say it's her body. Miller would say it's his soul, right? As we've seen in Perry's dialogue, some possible answers to this question are body, soul, as we'll discuss today, consciousness or memories. And then there's a question about pronouns with respect to social, affective, or social psychological constructive features of our human condition, such as gender or race and so forth. So are the pronouns I and you deeper and more essential than gendered pronouns such as she and him? So parenthetically, I ask, would it make sense to say that your soul has a gender if in fact you are identified with your soul? Or you might say there are no layers of identity that remain undetermined by such factors. And so you might respond in that way. And then the second prompt, hold on a second, I've got to let Abraham in the room. Okay. The second prompt, Weyrob asks Miller to prove that life after death is possible, not that it is probable. And we kind of discussed this already. In your own words, what is Weyrob asking for and what isn't she asking for? What role do memory and anticipation play in her inquiry? And then lastly, Why does Weyrauch argue that if at a future time, two or more persons have memories of your past experience, so this really came up, especially in the third night of their conversation, then it must follow that you did not survive to have those memories. In other words, why is what we call numerical identity essential for identity as such? So imagine a world, and for those familiar with the Netflix series Black Mirror, which is really great, there's an episode, I think it's the third season, called San Junipero. And so this is a world in which, because of the technological future, we can upload our consciousness prior to death to live in this deathless world. But it seems if that's possible, why not upload multiple versions of your conscious memories from the past, perhaps occupying different fictional or virtual cities? But if that were the case, so if one version of yourself or avatar, this representation of yourself in a virtual space, can be preserved beyond your body's death, then why not 2 or 3 or 300? And if this was the case, would it mean that you haven't survived at all? Okay, so I'll stop sharing, but are there any questions about the prompts before I put you guys into the groups?
Sounds like fun prompts. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so again, if you haven't yet contributed, and a number of you haven't, you have until Sunday to respond to the prompt in the forum, then this is an opportunity to start working through your thoughts on that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put you into the rooms now, and I'll let you know with about a minute or so in advance of my closing the rooms to prepare you for that. Okay, so I'll send you to the rooms now. All right, we're back. So I imagine you guys had some pretty fun conversations. So does anybody want to share? Anyone want to get us started?
I can get us started.
Sure.
We are looking at the "Who am I" prompt, and we actually came to two conclusions about who we are, I guess. So if you look at, for example, you're talking to a psychologist and they ask you how you are, you're going to tell them your feelings, right? You're not going to tell them like your arm hurts or whatever, right? You're going to tell them about your soul, about your mind. But if you say, for example, I'm going to go down the street to the store, that's what your body is doing. You as a body are going to walk on over to the store. So depending on how you look at it, you are both your body and your soul, which is kind of what we came to, which is very contradicting, but it's interesting to say the least.
Well, presumably though, when your body walks to the store, your soul's coming along, right?
That is very true, yes. And I guess if you want to think about it, your soul in a way is telling your body what to do. Like a kingdom is run by the ruler.
Good.
So in a way, your soul, I guess, is going to the store because it wants it to. The body is simply tagging along.
Right. So you might say, if you have to drive, for example, to the store, your car is going to the store, but of course it's you, in this instance, as a body that's piloting that vehicle, right? And this is more or less, as we'll see next week, how Descartes thinks of the relationship between body and soul, or for his purposes, body and mind, or body and consciousness. Those are all identical, mind, consciousness, thinking, subjectivity, those are all identical for Descartes, and also identical with the soul. Those simply pinpoint and elaborate on different functions or dimensions of the soul, as we'll see. And so he characterizes, and you might have heard this phrase before, some of you, he characterizes that relationship, mind and body or soul and body, as a ghost in the machine. So if anyone has heard that before, that comes from Rene Descartes, that your soul is like a ghost in the machine. But then, as we'll also see, that opens up some rather pressing questions about this mysterious relationship. How it is that something that is entirely immaterial can at all relate to, or further still, control or put to work something that is entirely material. So how is it that a soul can actually relate to the body? And so that's a metaphysical problem in connection to the idea of self as soul. But last time we talked about an epistemological problem of the self as soul, because epistemology being the theory of knowledge, how it is that we can know things. So if we're trying to figure out how we can know who we are, that is what our self or identity is at any moment, or how I can identify my experience of you in our session Tuesday with the two-dimensional face that I'm seeing before me now, how does that happen? Well, if it was the soul that facilitated that knowledge, then it would be entirely inexplicable. It would be entirely mysterious, because the soul is precisely that which, as definitionally immaterial, we never encounter by way of our senses. But remember, Weyrob was willing to leave it, in terms of the metaphysical side of this, leave it alone, that perhaps we do have souls. But now I just mentioned a particular metaphysical issue, but we don't need to get into that, because that's really on the table for next week when we talk in greater detail and depth about Descartes' theory of the soul. Good, so...
I have something to add.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was kind of thinking that you should split like the ego and the soul into two separate things. So you yourself, like your self-identity is your ego, and kind of more or less what gives you life is your soul. So you could kind of think of it as the difference between artificial intelligence and actual intelligence. One would have this soul, the other would not, but they both have sort of a sense of identity or awareness of things. So I kind of think that when you say I, you're referring to your ego, your physical existence and your experiences, and rather your soul is kind of above the limitations of like our primitive senses. So it's like a different thing altogether. It doesn't think or feel, more or less. It just kind of gives you life and allows you to exist. But your ego is like your identity.
So it's the ego that thinks and feels,
Yeah.
and then in virtue of those thoughts and feelings, brings them into a central sort of sameness, right? Self-sameness, such that one can say, I am now feeling this, and then minutes later, I am now thinking or feeling this, but the I as ego remains self, same, and consistent. So is that what you're saying?
I think so, kind of. I have to think through it a little
Yeah, I
bit
mean,
because
that's
it's kind of a complicated.
indeed. I read your contribution, by the way, your post to the forum. I found it very interesting and very uh, rather sophisticated and well thought through. So I appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah, and ego, by the way, in one sense, fundamentally, really just means I.
Yep.
So you have to sort of dig into the theoretical depths, as it were, of our historical or intellectual tradition to figure out what more is being said when we use the language of ego now, especially in the post-Freudian psychological or psychoanalytic landscape. We have to be a little bit clear about what we mean by ego. But it sounds like what you're saying behind it all ultimately is a kind of self-awareness.
Yeah.
And that self-awareness is what allows me, first of all, to acknowledge myself. As Miller begins the second day, he suggests that, and by the way, this is a vague kind of allusion to Avicenna's thought experiment of the floating man that we'll talk about next week, when he suggests not to step on the toes of the presenters yet, because you'll probably talk about this, but like if you wake up in the morning, before you even open your eyes or move, you still know who you are. So as Alexander was putting it, or Alec, if you prefer to go by that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, Alec was putting it, you are tethered to yourself, which means that all of the things by which you recognize yourself, so thoughts, feelings, and so forth, are all brought together. And the locus of that togetherness is the ego, or the I. And that's why, referring again to Freudian psychoanalysis, beyond the ego in terms of the constitution of selfhood, there's also the id, right? So there is the unconscious, which in its relationship to the ego, to use this metaphor, is like the substance below the tip of the iceberg that you can never see, right? So the ego would be like that, relatively speaking, minimal or insubstantial tip that is undergirded and supported in ways of which we're rarely aware by this dark kind of subterranean churning contexture or substance, if you want to put it that way. Yeah, so, and then something else you said, Alec, so distinguishing ego from soul. And you talked about the soul is that which gives life or is maybe identical to life.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's actually really in line with the ancient Greek conception of soul as psyche to some extent. So that's actually, or obviously, where we get words in English like psyche, psychology, psychiatric. It derives from psyche, from the Greek. And for the Greeks, and here I mean specifically Plato and Aristotle, but especially Aristotle, because he's the one who kind of systematically codified a lot of these concepts, although he was drawing on what Plato supplied before him. But according to Aristotle, psyche is, first of all, that which endows an organism with life. And so this is what Aristotle primarily drew from Plato in the dialogue Phaedo, which we talked about before, as that in which Socrates at the end drinks the hemlock and dies. And during the course of the whole conversation, he's really trying to assuage the anxieties and fears of his followers that the soul might survive bodily death. But death is defined in the context of that dialogue as the separation of soul from body. That's all death is. And it's because soul, or psyche, is the principle that distinguishes a corpse from a living organism. And so it gives, first of all, the capacity of life, soul does. But then Aristotle builds on that and says there are layers or dimensions of the soul in virtue of which, or because of which, as capacities, we are able to do things in the world. And by the way, Aristotle, and this is where he's very much in his theoretical orientation here, distinct from Descartes, as we'll see next week. It isn't just human beings for Aristotle who are endowed with soul. It's all living organisms, including plants. And furthermore, human beings are in their very ontological constitution, just in terms of the beings that we are plant-like. We share a foundational metaphysical affinity with plants, according to Aristotle. So think of our automatic bodily functions over which we exert no conscious control. So we continue to breathe when we're sleeping, our hair grows, we engage in digestion, metabolism, and so forth. Well, Aristotle says those are the characteristics of us that our plant-like soul make possible. Just like in plants, the processes of growth and photosynthesis and so forth are automatic. But beyond that, we have the animal layer of soul, which we share with non-human animals. And that's what endows us with the ability to move. So locomotion, moving from one place to another. That's what gives us desires, appetites, feelings. And it's also what gives us the capacity to perceive, right? To open ourselves up to the world through the five senses. And then further, there's the last or third layer of soul for Aristotle, which gives us intellect or rational thought. And that's the uniquely human layer of soul, which as human, however, presupposes or requires the other dimensions of soul for it to be. So in that sense, we are human, but we're also animals, and we're also, in the important sense that I mentioned, plants. But as we'll see next week, Descartes entirely parts ways with that, and this informs much of modernity and says, no, human beings are unique in the world. We're the only ones with soul. And he identifies soul with only the last of those three functions. It's the intellectual aspect of ourselves, robust self-consciousness, and our ability to measure and to calculate and so forth, and to manipulate material nature for our own ends. And so that's just to sort of put in our minds where we'll be going next week in our discussion. But
could I make a comment real quick?
yeah, of course, go ahead.
I kind of have two things to say. I am probably going to forget what the second one is. This is going to be an intimidating argument to make after all of the stuff you just said about Aristotle. But it kind of goes, the thing I was going to say goes back to what Noel was saying earlier about the argument of if you're going to the store, your body is going, your soul's kind of tagging along, like that sort of thing. If you're talking to a psychologist and they ask how you are, that question, you're not going to answer with a physical, oh, my arm hurts. Like, you're going to answer with a response that has to do with your mental state or your emotional state. And that was sort of the argument for the existence of a soul. My argument is, can we even say that with any level of confidence? Because we can observe such a huge physical relation between mental state and emotional state and the physical body. Like when I'm feeling stressed, like personally, I don't believe that has to do with my soul. I believe it has to do with the cortisol hormone in my brain being released as a physical, biological response to whatever I'm going through. When I feel afraid, my brain releases adrenaline and my heart pumps faster so that if I need to run from whatever I feel like is after me, like that's possible. Like that's such a huge biological response. If I'm feeling very connected to my romantic partner, I don't personally believe that that's a soul connection. I believe that's because of the oxytocin in my brain being released, which makes you feel bonded to your partner, like how it would when you're a baby and you're breastfeeding and you need to feel more connected to your mother. Like, I don't know. It's just interesting to note, like, all of these things that we kind of are arguing mean the existence of a soul. We can also kind of just point all of those things toward a biological response.
Good, yeah, so you're really pushing forward this kind of physicalist or materialist conception of identity. Not so much identity in what you were just saying, but in terms of how we understand ourselves and the way we experience the world and respond to external stimuli and so forth. You're suggesting, we're arguing that we don't need this mysterious other thing, which as Weyrob shows is unobservable, this thing we call the soul, right? And it's also worth noting that other ancient philosophers after Aristotle in the Hellenistic world, like Epicurus, for example, who's very influential on utilitarianism in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries, and even now, He thought that the soul is a kind of body. So he was an atomist, right? But he thought that it was just more rarefied or more diffuse than the body. And actually some contemporaries of Descartes who resisted his firm dualism between soul and body. So I'm thinking of the brilliant thinker Anne Conway. She's a great early modern philosopher, and she, I think, really adequately tore apart Descartes' arguments grounded in dualism on a kind of weird basis of like a Christian Kabbalism. Is really weird, but it's interesting stuff. But yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that, right? But then the thing is, like, you can say, oh, I am just my brain, as we might want to say. And then the brain is the seat of, or at least a major contributor as an organ to the deployment of these bodily physicochemical processes, right? But then you can say, well, just like the soul, from the first person vantage of my everyday experience, what relationship do I have to my brain? Unless human beings, I mean, if it weren't for the fact that human beings experience horrific trauma and death, we would never be aware that we had a brain in the first place, or that we have these strange organs doing weird shit inside our bodies that we have no immediate access to. So it sounds strange to me to say, I am my brain, or that we often use this language, I think, mistakenly.
That's very true.
Like in the sciences, oh, my brain is doing this, or my brain is making me do this. Well, aren't you in that very language separating you from your brain? And your brain doesn't do anything, really. You're doing things. Your brain is involved, but we can't reduce everything to your brain. I mean, after all, we don't see just a bunch of disembodied brains floating about the world. So there's still some difficulties there. And bridging the gap between our first person experience as consciousness of the world and how we can open up the hood, so to speak, as people try to do in neuroscience and so forth, and making correlations between mental states and physical brain states. So good, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Tiffany. So any other thoughts come up? Any other interesting things come up in your discussions? But Noel, I just wanted to ask you, because I recently read your contribution, and you bravely took on, I think, probably the most difficult of the 3 prompts. And you said that you think Weyrob is wrong about that. But would you care to explain just what you had in mind there?
I mean, I could save it for the presentation because I'll be going quite in depth with
okay,
this.
we'll just do that then. Yeah.
Okay.
Good, cool. All right. So anything else, or? Okay, there's some stuff in the chat. Brain. So Thea says, brains are very manipulable. You have to send the signal for your brain to do something. So what is it that sets the intention to do anything at all? That's an excellent question. So obviously, and we'll talk about this when we get to Hume, right? Especially the second time, really, when we get to Hume. But I think right now I want to raise my arm. So I raise my arm. And it seems like there's nothing strange about that or demanding an explanation. Yet, how does that happen? The space, the interval between my will expressed in my thinking to raise my arm and the moment that that actually happens as an event out in the world is so infinitesimally small, so inscrutable. I don't even know what's going on. How do I do that? And so that, rather than satisfying the question, opens it up a little further. Like, exactly how do I, even if I am a soul or a mind or a brain, even if I do want to think I'm just this physical organ, well, what exactly is it that sets all these chemicals in motion when I make a decision or I want to do something, right? So yeah, those are some really good questions.
I have a question that I
Yeah.
just remembered.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you're vouching for the argument that you are your soul, how does that relate to personality disorders, like dissociative identity disorder? Would that be 10 souls? Or how would that relate to antisocial personality disorders like sociopathy, psychopathy, narcissism? What's the connection between the soul and the brain to do that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And that cuts right to the heart of the metaphysical problem with the soul that I was talking about before. And this is what we'll refer to when we get to Descartes next week as the mind-body problem. So that's a famous problem in the history of philosophy that seems to have no satisfying answer. Descartes himself never had a satisfying answer, although he struggled with it. So good. Okay, cool. So let me jump back in. There's just a few more slides to clarify the Lockean view, and then this will help to prepare understanding what's going on in the second and third nights for our presenters. Okay, so let me share the screen again. And so while you guys were in the breakout rooms, I started populating our little open field here with potential responses or candidates as answers to this question. And so different philosophers or different ways of responding or thinking through these problems result in different orientations or approaches, each of which have their own sort of sub-answers. So we can talk about the self or the I as a substance, an object, or a thing. And for our purposes, for simplicity's sake, I mean all of those things interchangeably. So all of those ideas. So the soul or the self or the I is a substance, like this coffee cup is a substance, or it's an object or a thing. And objects, substances, and things are the seat, and this is in accordance with Locke's theory, are the seat of properties or qualities which qualify them and condition them in certain ways. So body is a substance, but as we've seen, soul is also a kind of substance, albeit an immaterial one. It's a thing, and Descartes uses this language explicitly. He calls the soul res cogitans, which in the Latin means thinking thing. Whereas the body is res extensa, which is extended thing. Or we can think of the self as organism. But then Locke rejects all of these and appeals to self as an activity, as a temporal unfolding, which means memory acts as the medium that stitches together various parts of one's personhood or one's experience in the world to actually undergird and form personhood and constitute and preserve it. And so that's something different rather than self as substance. And then we'll see a different answer that would fall perhaps meaningfully into this category that Immanuel Kant gives us, the famous 18th century German philosopher who was reacting rather critically to Hume's effort to dissolve the self entirely. So we'll talk about that later. But let me jump ahead to where we left off last time. So Locke, when we're pursuing the principle of individuation for any given phenomenon, because remember, identity is a feature of ultimately logic, but it's a feature, logically speaking, in accordance with which we understand phenomena or appearances in the world. So some are substances, some are organisms, and some are persons. So a substance is something that is made up entirely of material stuff. And so that stuff can have parts, like this coffee cup has a lid, it has sides and so forth. Or more fundamentally, it can be made of atoms and so forth. An organism refers to a living body, whether a plant, animal, or human, that's composed of parts, which importantly aren't just haphazardly or randomly thrown together, but they're organized in a particular pattern that ensures continuity. And then there is, lastly, a person. And we've already talked about how Locke identifies person. It's a rational, reflective, thinking, self-aware being, and this is what we call the self. And so now we'll just briefly look at the different responses So the different ways of framing the principle of individuation in these cases and entertain problems with them when trying to locate the human in all of them, or at least the first two. But there are issues with the personhood account that Locke gives us, grounded in memory. So this rock, for example, is substance, and the principle of individuation of substances is mass. So inanimate objects like rocks are, so inanimate objects like rocks are substances only. They're not living organisms or persons. And so the principle of individuation is really just the stuff of which it's made, which can be measured by a scientific criterion like mass. So if you have a rock such as this one, and you were to, if you see my cursor, take off the tiniest little piece, right? Chip off the tiniest little piece, which no one would even notice. It is, if we're being very precise and rigorous, it's not strictly speaking the same rock, because now the mass has been altered. And now you have a different thing, a different substance, and now another different thing. So the little piece of the rock that we've chipped off. And so human beings in our personal identity can't be reduced to the principle of individuation of substances as mass, and why not? So what's the problem here? So why can't we think of human persons as self-identical in terms of mere mass?
Well, I mean, what if you just like lose a hair or something? You've lost a very small bit of mass, but it's still mass.
Exactly, right. And people, unfortunately, have limbs removed, whether through kitchen accidents or operations and amputation and so forth, yet we don't think they're a radically different person, right? They still maintain the same identity. And furthermore, we can appeal to science fiction scenarios like we encountered in this story. So there are all kinds of films like Freaky Friday or Prelude to a Kiss. Neither of those films are particularly good, but they show instances in which somehow a person changes bodies, yet they're the same person. But this is really more a problem with organism, as we'll see. And Locke actually talks about that way back in the 17th century, so before science fiction. So now the principle of individuation of organisms, it's life. So note that living things such as plants, animals, and human beings are both substances and organisms, but they're not persons. And this is according to Locke. You might disagree, I tend to disagree, but according to Locke, the thing that makes a living thing that it is, such as this example of an oak tree, is not the matter that makes it up, because the matter changes dramatically, right? And of course, I'm sure we all know that our body replaces the very cells that constitute its organism periodically throughout time, right? So you are literally not, in the material sense, the same being that you were upon birth. And so the oak tree was once a tiny sapling, and it's continuously losing old parts, replacing them with new ones, yet we don't think that it becomes a new entity. We don't ascribe a different identity to it. So the thing that seems to make the tree the same tree over time is not the matter, but the way that matter is composed in a coherent and self-consistent, perduring organization. So as long as it remains one continuous life, so here we're talking about the bodily continuity of the organism, we say it's the same tree.
I have another question.
Sure, yeah.
So they found out that plants can feel and react to stimuli. So if you argue that you are your soul, would a plant have a soul?
No, that's exactly what Aristotle thought. Aristotle thought that plants had souls. And he even had a very interesting comment in his work, De Anima, which is on the nature of the soul. It's his treatise on the metaphysics of the soul. He even talks about plants and says, it's interesting that certain plant organisms, if you cut a shoot off, for example, and this is the case with many, if not all of them, You can, the conditions being ideal or appropriate, you can take a piece off of a plant and it becomes a new plant. It will stand on its own and grow its own developing shoots and so forth. And so Aristotle commented on that and said, this is something interesting about plants, that they are, like all souls, whether human, plant, or animal, individual, singular in actuality, but in potentiality, they are multiple. And that's why you can draw on that potentiality when you cut a little piece off of a plant and it now becomes a new one. But that doesn't seem to work with humans or most animals. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's interesting. But as we'll see next week, Descartes, so representing the modern approach to the concept of soul, disagrees with that. But so now, what is the principle of individuation of persons? Well, it can't be the same as either material substances or organism, and for the reasons Noel was just giving us. So clearly, if I lose a material part of my body, I nevertheless continue to be the same person. If you cut off my foot, I'm still the same person. So that means my body has changed, but I wouldn't say that I have changed. I still know who I am. You still know who I am, and so forth. I'm reminded of a great horror film from the 1970s called The Tenant by Roman Polanski, the maker also of Rosemary's Baby. Has anybody seen that, The Tenant?
Nope.
Well, it's really great. The main character is actually played by Roman Polanski, the director. He's this alienated Polish immigrant in Paris who has no friends or family. And at one point, he's creeped out by this apartment, and he finds in a hole in the wall in the apartment a tooth. And he's drunk and he's talking about it, the weirdness of being a body or having a body. I mean, which is it? Are we a body or do we have a body? But he says, if I take out my tooth, I say, here's my tooth and here's me. I cut off my arm. I say, here's me, here's my arm. But if you cut off my head, I say, here's my head, here's my body. But then he asks, what right does my head have to achieve authority over my whole persona, over my whole being, right? So it's a weird kind of question. But there's some activity in the chat. Let me see. Okay, yeah, Freaky Friday isn't that bad. Yeah, was Lindsay Lohan in that movie? Am I
Actually,
remembering?
I have, I don't know, a question or an idea. You were discussing that movie and about the quote of what does my head have, or what right does my head have to be me? But, and while I agree with that statement, to give a counter idea, considering the head holds the brain, which holds your consciousness, your thoughts, your memories, in a way, isn't your head the closest you have to being just you?
Yeah, I mean, that's how Cohen and Miller seem to think at the conclusion of our dialogue, right? Although really seemingly irrationally to me, at some point, Weyrob resists all of that, right? Trying to maintain her view of materialism or physicalism, even though, as I stated last time, the brain is, strictly speaking, bodily, right? So, but yeah, so depending upon how you think about the relationship again between mind and how that plays into the role of selfhood and brain, right? You might think that. Okay. So we're finishing up here and then we're going to move on to our presenters. But this is that thought experiment which influenced a lot of science fiction to come. So Freaky Friday, for example. So there's this thought experiment he talks about way back in the 17th century, or a little bit later than that. He was kind of on the cusp of those centuries, but The Prince and the Cobbler. So imagine that the memories or the consciousness of a prince were somehow transferred to the body of a cobbler. So, someone who makes a shoe or shoes. And so the cobbler wakes up, he thinks he's the prince. He claims to be the prince. He remembers acting in the capacity of the prince. And then on the other side, the cobbler wakes up. The cobbler as the mind, he wakes up in the prince's body, but he still has all the memories of the cobbler and so forth. Would we say that the prince now inhabits the living body or organism of the cobbler and vice versa? Well, Locke thinks that our basic intuition would say yes. Most of us would agree that the prince, having had his consciousness transferred to the body of the cobbler, would nevertheless self-identify still as the prince. And so this is sufficient, according to Locke, to conclude that sameness of person does not mean sameness of organism. So what do you guys think about that? Do you think Locke is right?
By organism, like what are you talking about specifically? Like
So
your body?
yeah, organism, remember, isn't just body, because that could mean a corpse or a rock or a grain of sand or whatever else. But an organism is bodily, of course, but what's important, and this is actually what organism means, going all the way back to the Greek, organon, and organon is that's actually a label for one of Aristotle's texts on logic, but organon is like a part. It's a part that relates to a whole, that plays a role with respect to a whole. So the organism is a whole, a bodily whole that's made up of functional parts, each of which contribute to some necessary aspect of the being of the whole. And so the organism would just be the living body that's made up of organs, right, or functional parts. But the organism, so the body, but also the way in which the parts of the body are put together in a functional organization have changed. But the consciousness on the part of the prince that's now occupying, you might say, a different organism, and the body of the cobbler is still self-identical in terms of the prince's memories of past experience, feelings, thoughts, and so forth. So we would say, pointing to this person who seems to be the person whom we identified the day before as the cobbler, we would say, well, it's really the prince, because he has the prince's memories and consciousness. Or even if we as outsiders might not be immediately disposed to bring ourselves to that conclusion, at least the person who seems to be the cobbler, Locke thinks, would identify still as the prince, right? Because those are the memories that that person has, right? Does that make sense?
Wait, isn't the cobbler just like a cobbler who thinks he's a prince?
Well, the cobbler wakes up with the memories of the prince, right? But it's important to note that at the same time, somewhere else, the body of the prince wakes up with the memories of the cobbler in this thought experiment. So it's a thought experiment. It's not actually possible. But the idea is, if it were possible, how would we conclude who is who? Does that make sense?
Yeah. There would be some differences though, because your body and the physical space you take up in the world is like a part of your identity, right? Like if you had a different body, you wouldn't be the exact same person as you were before.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess if you transferred consciousness to another body, there's different brain chemistry. So would you be the same person, but with totally different chemistry, and you would have different emotions, different hormones, like a lot of things would be different about you. So I don't think you would be the same person. I think you would be a different person.
That's true.
Or
but
a new person.
Yeah, true. But even without these weird science fiction scenarios, we can experience a change in brain chemistry or subtle or dramatic alterations of our body, yet we still identify as in some important sense the same. And the reason that we do that, drawing back on Weyrauch, is because, again, anticipation and memory, right? So the reason, even though I can recognize that I changed, and it's important to note too that if I say I have changed, what does that sentence suggest and entail? Well, a couple interesting things. A change has taken place, but not such a change that there can no longer be a self-same I. So if everything has changed, I can't say I have changed because there's nothing that has, despite those changes, remained the same to say that a change has taken place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I also have something else to ask.
Sure, sure.
So if you changed, since you're in a new body and new chemistry and stuff, at what point are you a different person? So if you keep changing little bits about you, what's the threshold to becoming someone else opposed to being the same person?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So with incremental small changes, at what point can you no longer say, I am the same person or a different person even, but you're just now a different consciousness altogether with no important anchor of connection that brings you into an affinity with this past iteration. So it's no longer an iteration, it's a new self, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. Cool. Okay, so I'm having a trouble with my cursor here. Okay. So just to further this, and then this is one of the last slides. So some suggest, like Descartes, that there is some non-material part of a human being and a person, and this touches on the question that you were just posing, Alec. A person remains the same just as long as they retain that immaterial part. They call this immaterial part the soul. So the body can change, but the soul doesn't. So Locke disagrees with this, though, and for a couple of reasons. So we can imagine, first of all, the same consciousness being transferred to a different material object or soul. So we are thinking of, for instance, the bodies of the prince and the cobbler. We're talking about like the soul changing or something like that. So my soul goes into a different body. But imagine the soul remains the same. So my soul doesn't leave, but still somehow my memories or my consciousness get transferred. So now that consciousness is transferred not only to a new body, but to a new soul too. Well, what would that entail? Well, it's a different soul, but the same consciousness. So we have the same issue when we're talking about this in connection to body and not soul as well. But then on the other hand, we can imagine the same soul being shared by two persons. So imagine that I am actually the reincarnation of Socrates. So when I was born, Socrates' soul entered into my body, and I don't know this, but I happen to be the reincarnated life of Socrates in the 21st century. But if that's true, even just taking that for granted that it's true, does that mean I should be held responsible for the shit that Socrates did in the past? Or that if I can put myself back in the position of Socrates, that I could anticipate having my experiences now as Justin Harmon in the 21st century? Well, Locke doesn't seem to think so. That Socrates would have no right to anticipate my future experiences, and I can't really be held responsible for the shit that Socrates did 2,000 years ago, which means that sameness of soul also doesn't conclude with sameness of person.
Yeah, because if you were the reincarnation of Socrates and you have no memory of Socrates, then you're not Socrates.
Exactly, right? Because just like the examples in the dialogue of the river, for example, how do we know that this part of the river, separated by many miles and many twists and turns from this later part of the river, is part of the same river? Well, because they're importantly causally connected. If there's a break in the path of the water, it's no longer the same river. Or like the example, the baseball game. How do we know that if we're at a double header, that we're in the same game or the second game if we go to the bathroom or if we wait in line to buy a beer? Well, we have to get some understanding of the relationship between the innings, right? And so there's an important causal connection of sustained continuity, and that is for Locke memory. Okay, so this is the last slide, and I'm not going to go over these. These are just problems with the memory view to keep in mind, and we can talk about these, and maybe the presenters will want to talk about them. But if Locke is correct, if memory or consciousness is the principle of individuation, what are some problems with this? Well, as discussed in the dialogue, false memories. So we're often unreliable narrators of our own past experience. We very easily misremember things or forget things, as with memory loss. And then Locke also has this problem of punishing the drunkard, in response to which he's willing to bite the bullet. So someone points out, well, what if you get shit-faced, wasted, blackout drunk, and you do a bunch of embarrassing or destructive things, and you don't remember having done them the next day? Well, there's a split in your memory. So can we say it's no longer you, or rather you didn't do that? So we can't punish the drunkard, as it were. Locke says, well, maybe we can't. Maybe we shouldn't. I don't know. So that's a problem. So let me get out of this. I'll stop sharing. So are there any questions or comments about any of that? No? Okay, so presenters, if you guys would like to take over, do you have any, are you going to use any media or anything?
No, it's all verbal.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, go ahead. So you guys are the first. I really appreciate you signing up for that role. And so let's all give Amanda and Noel our attention.
So I'll just start it off first. I looked at the second night of dialogue while Noel looked at the third night. And something that I really came to focus on was, the development of the personal identity of the self, which, is the whole point of the argument. But a lot of the argument really kind of boiled down to is that, like, what is consciousness? Basically, is that, like, is consciousness the basis of self-identity? And that's kind of where I interpret it, and where I have taken it is that that identity is consciousness, and it's based in the reading based off of the idea of remembering, which is also what we just talked about, in that the idea that the memory is what provides that concept of self, because it is the memory of what has happened to the rememberer. So I remember me, and this also goes to the distinction of the other, which is kind of the basic, like the most easiest way to differentiate the self and the other, is that I am me and the other is the other. And since I have no conscious pull or influence over the other, therefore they are not me, because there's no connection. And there was brought up in the reading the idea of the creation of a separate heavenly body, that, oh, what if God made a second Weirab and gave her all of the same memories, that fundamentally wouldn't be, it would be a separate person. Identically, they're the same, but there's still that perception of the original Weirab standing there saying that I am me, I have all of these memories, and I am perceiving something else that is not me. And while it is identical down to like molecular function, down to like if the copy's conscious content is that that still that only you can perceive your own consciousness, if that makes any sense whatsoever. that since the other is outside of your own perception and control of autonomy, that it is not the self. And so if you recognize immediately that the other self is not you, by way of addressing it, is that your identity and the identity of the self comes from that recognition of the self, and that there is that basic human differentiation between self and other, and that is shown at almost every level of sentience. That and I mean, to varying degrees, like dogs will be like, oh, I am dog, and then they look in a mirror and say, who is other dog? And it's still, it's still fundamentally the same dog, but there is that perception of who is this new dog? Why do they look like me? Why are they doing this? And there's no like perception there that like, oh, maybe this is the exact same dog. And I mean, certain other creatures with higher faculties, so to say, like certain birds will pass the mirror test, where birds will be able to be like, oh, that is me. But there's still the understanding there that the self is just the recognition of conscience and possession of that sapience. And that's, thank you, pretty well brought down in night 2, and then it continues on to night 3, which I will cede to Noel.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. In night 3, the three of them, Weyrob, Miller, and Cohen, kind of abandoned the idea of trying to convince Weyrob about survival after death and pursue just what personal identity is as a whole. And I'm going to go kind of out of order here by giving the example first. They tell this story of Julia North, and I'll recall it for you in case you don't remember. Essentially, we have a woman named Mary Frances and her child are walking along some railroad tracks, and the child falls on the tracks. And as a result, the mother, Mary Frances, she has a stroke. And so the way they put it is that her brain is wasted, but her body is still healthy. And so this lady named Julia North, she comes and she saves the child from the tracks, but as a result, she gets run over by the train. So her body is wasted, but her brain is somehow still healthy. So what happens is there's a doctor that performs an operation on the two and transfers the brain from Julia North, which is still healthy, into the body of Mary Frances, which is still healthy. And as a result, there is one person that rises from the table after the operation is over. But the big question is, who survived the operation? Was it Julia North or was it Mary Frances? And this is where the points of view of Weyrob, Miller, and Cohen kind of split, because Weyrob thinks that personal identity is equivalent to bodily identity. So he thinks, seeing Mary Frances's body in front of him, that she survived. But Cohen and Miller believe that personal identity is linked with the mind and memory, which would lead them to believe that Julia North survived, since it's her brain in question. And if we go a little farther into Weyrob's theory of bodily identity, by using an example of identical twins, we could see how it's kind of faulted. If you have two identical twins, obviously their bodies are exactly alike. They have different personalities and aspirations and whatnot. So it kind of, in that respect, Miller and Cohen, as far as the mind being your identity, are correct. But Weyrob's bodily identity is kind of faulty here, because them having the same bodies, you can't tell which one is person A and person B. They're both person A, obviously, right? And so that's where, in my opinion, his opinion is kind of faulty there. And if we look at, there's another example where you duplicate memory. which in this case, we're going to try to prove the idea that personal identity is linked with your memory or experiences. And so there's this idea that the doctor was working on, that he could duplicate a brain and all the memory associated with it. And so the idea was, what if Weyrob donated a duplicate of her brain to someone else, and they both woke up from the operation having the same memory of everything that happened prior to the operation? Just looking at it like that, at face value, they have the same memory, therefore, and they're both claiming to be the same person, therefore neither of them are Weyrob. But if you continue through their life cycle and they live their own unique lives as if nothing ever happened, they start making their own unique memories, which brings up a really interesting question, in that their memories are the same prior to the operation, but they differ afterwards. So there's this very harsh line between similar and dissimilar memories, and which kind of confuses the theory that personal identity is linked with their memory and their experiences, because they are alike at one point, but they differ at another, which is kind of just in a very odd and interesting thing to think about. And with that, I conclude night 3.
Good. All right, wonderful. So thank you. There's a lot to chew on there, but before I jump in and pose questions, I'd like to open up to the class. So does anyone have a question or a comment?
I do.
A challenge or something? Yeah, so go ahead, Alec.
So if you transfer a brain, would that mean the soul doesn't have an identity? Because you're not transferring the soul, you're transferring the brain.
In my opinion, I believe the soul is in a way attached to the brain, in that memory itself resides in the brain, right? And to determine if a soul is, to determine the identity of a soul, you look at memory and experience, in my eyes at least. So if you give a brain to another person, you are now that other person, even if you have a new body. But in this scenario, your brain is simply duplicated. So in my eyes, perhaps the original brain, the template, not the duplicate, is the person as they are actually remembering. But the new brain was created from thin air, and that person is only seeming to remember, which is an important differentiation between seeming and actually remembering.
Okay.
Just to build on what Alec asked, though, what happens causally, perhaps, with respect to the soul in this process, this duplicating process? And we can maybe appeal to certain science fiction scenarios, like, if anybody has seen it, that San Junipero episode of Black Mirror. So if we imagine that, for example, it is possible, and it seems more and more like it could be the case, actually, it is possible to create a virtual afterlife or a virtual heaven, some sort of cloud into which we can upload our consciousness upon death. What happens if, at the same time, if we also believe metaphysically that there are these entities we call the soul, then what happens? So is the soul also uploaded to this domain, or is the soul, is it somehow then prevented from going to heaven, or what's going on there? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Also, if you duplicated your brain, how does the other brain obtain a soul? It's a non-material thing, so how do you create it or destroy it or copy it?
That actually stops me from what I was going to say, because the fact that it's immaterial kind of disproves what I was about to mention, which was that somehow, I mean, I guess like a baby is born, a soul is born with it in a way, that like when they duplicated the brain, think of it like a child being born, and that a new soul was created for that brain, but it inhabited the memories of Weyrob's brain. So at birth, it has all of her memories.
So you think the soul is duplicated along with the
Correct. So it's not one soul between two bodies, it's one soul per body.
Oh, okay, because that's interesting. But another way you could answer is to say that, and I thought this was what you were suggesting, but I could be mistaken, that although the brain states in terms of memory and consciousness are duplicated, the soul is not. So there's something like artificial in the duplicated version. I thought that's what you were saying, but maybe not.
I didn't actually
too.
see when I thought of this example, I didn't actually take into account the soul, because my mind was that the soul was attached to the brain, and if the brain was duplicated, a soul came with it, kind of thing. So I don't actually have a good answer for if the soul couldn't be duplicated, since it is immaterial. So that'd be interesting to hear any thoughts on it, for sure.
Yeah, also, I have another thing. So if you go brain dead, right, and you come back to life, why didn't your soul leave while you were dead?
Yeah, I mean, there are many cases of that occurring, right, where people are dead for several minutes, even. And
Some
then,
even days.
right, yeah. True. So I don't know, is the soul in some state of limbo? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Oh, so Tiffany is asking, just real quick, if we could clone people, would a clone just be a husk of a person, since you supposedly can't create a soul? That's something that we'll talk about in the context of Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, 9 Lives. That's something we could consider then. Is the soul different than consciousness? Well, that depends on who you're asking. As I've mentioned, when we look at in detail the soul view as articulated by Rene Descartes next week, he thinks yes, soul is precisely that which gives us consciousness, is the seat of consciousness, and by consciousness he means really the capacity to think. So thinking, consciousness, soul, they're all of a piece in terms of res cogitans, or thinking substance, as he puts it. But as I mentioned earlier, for Aristotle, there are different dynamic capacities or functions of the soul beyond thinking. But that's Descartes' view. So is someone going to jump in there? I thought I heard someone.
Just to clarify, what do we? I'm not sure what we mean by soul.
Well, I've talked.
I'm confused.
Yeah, there are different. I mean, different religious traditions, different philosophical approaches.
Yeah, but like if we're gonna talk about, like, I don't know, like making arguments and stuff, shouldn't we agree on what a soul means?
Well, you might have to make an argument in terms of your interpretation of what a soul is.
Yeah,
So,
right now we're going off of Noel's interpretation of a soul.
yeah, and some difficulty there in terms of whether or not it can be duplicated. But what's important here, just for Mozu, for clarity's sake, is whatever we know about the soul, at this point, we're talking about it being immaterial. So that's what's important here. We might not agree on exactly what the soul is, but whether we're talking about Aristotle's point of view or Descartes or Plato or whatever else, the Christian point of view, which is Descartes, by the way, we're talking about something immaterial, non-physical. But I did suggest that there are certain contrary philosophers throughout this history that have suggested otherwise. But the most pervasive or common understanding of soul is as this sort of non-physical, immaterial substance, because of which, as we've seen in the dialogue, it can't be observed, which means it can't be seen, touched, heard, tasted, or smelled.
So it doesn't exist? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, if you're asking,
I mean, that's that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a satisfying answer. If it, like, it's not, it doesn't literally exist, but like it exists in this discussion.
Sure,
right?
yeah. So
Well, that's kind of like to say, like, the notion of a god, like, where's your proof of that at all? There's none. Some people argue
Yeah.
it exists.
Yeah, but we have to continue believing that, right?
What do you mean? What do we have to believe?
Like, we have to believe, like, that we have souls, right?
No, I mean,
Because
I don't think I have a
Well,
soul.
I mean, but you say I, yeah.
Yeah,
I
but
mean,
that
like,
doesn't necessarily mean, so really what we're asking about, I mean, only one possible answer to the question of I is soul. So that's not the only
that's what I
answer.
mean.
Yeah. So when I say I, if I'm Weyrob, I could mean my body. Or if I'm Descartes, I could mean my soul. Or if I'm Locke, I could mean my consciousness, that is my memories, and so forth. But as we'll see, if I'm David Hume, I don't mean anything at all. David Hume thinks there's no such thing as a soul. Or further beyond that, there's no such thing as an I or a self. He thinks it's an illusion, and that's what we're going to talk about in week 4, during which week we'll also talk about the Buddhist conception of self as no self. And so Hume was actually influenced quite a bit by that as a Western philosopher. So we'll talk about both in week 4. But I wanted to, and I'll leave it open for others too, but I wanted to go back to something Noel was saying, and this connects also to your response to the discussion forum. So you were saying that you're challenging Weyrob's physical view and her idea of selfhood having to involve numerical identity specifically. And you appealed to identical twins for your challenge. But remember, identical does not mean exact similarity. So identical twins, what we really mean is exactly similar twins, if we're being precise or accurate in our language. Because if they were identical twins, they wouldn't be twins, they would be one. So that's why Weyrob keeps pushing that point. Identity means self-sameness. So what's different about identical twins? Well, for one thing, they don't occupy the same volume of space. So they have different properties, at least in the sense of spatial presence and differentiation, right? So I could say, even if I have 2 identical twins before me, it's still not A and A, it's A and B, at least to the extent that they occupy different areas of space and time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do now seem to recall reading about them explaining what identical is. But I guess I forgot about it.
Yeah, that's okay. Good. So it's a subtle point, but it's important just to be clear about what Weyrob is arguing in her challenge. And so I'm actually reminded on that point too. And you brought up a great scenario that's very helpful. If Weyrob were duplicated exactly, so her brain states were duplicated, at the moment of duplication, we might say, even though there's still the difference of spatial property, so we're still dealing with non-identity, but still at that very moment of creation, where the two share the same past experiences, we might say they're in most important respects exactly similar. But then you said if they were to part ways, live their lives, they would undergo different experiences, remember those different experiences in different ways, and thus, strictly speaking, have really radically different personas. And so I'm reminded, if anyone's a fan of Star Trek Next Generation, has anybody seen, if there are fans of that show, there's an episode, I don't recall the season, but it's called Second Chances, in which the character Riker, without knowing it, is involved in a transporter error. So if anyone's familiar with the Star Trek universe, there are these transporter machines which literally deconstruct atomically your entire body, and then those atoms are reorganized. They're brought back together in a different spatial location. So that opens up all kinds of interesting questions. You might say, well, are you really killed every time you transport and then are brought back? And so are you a different being? But leaving those weird questions aside, in this episode, for some reason, he's visiting a strange part of space, and there's an accident with the transporter, and a duplicate of Riker, atom by atom, is made and left in that place, but nobody knew. And the original Riker leaves, and then later they have to revisit this to solve some problem. And oh, so Alec, you've seen that. Yeah, so they revisit and Riker ends up walking face to face with his doppelganger, with his other. And the one question is, well, who's the real Riker? Who's the true Riker? Well, they both think they're the real Riker. And there is no real Riker. Why? Because they were split simultaneously in one. So it's not a relationship of original to copy, but they were split into two versions of themselves. And at that moment, they had precisely the same memories and experiences and so forth. But the duplicated Riker, and again, we don't know which is duplicated, but the one who stayed, rather, is more clear to say, the one who stayed had to fend for himself for like 8 years or something, or some long period of time. I don't remember exactly how long it was. And so his experiences were radically different than the other Rikers, and they actually end up hating each other. And they fight the whole episode. And so, I mean, that has some interesting implications about personal identity as grounded necessarily in our experiences, right? So even if we were to, going to Tiffany's question, even if we were to create a clone of ourselves, at the precise moment of creation, there's exact similarity, but then as time goes on and experiences differ, and those tracks of experience diverge more and more, then we get more and more different people, right? So it might be experience, and then furthermore, perhaps Locke is onto something in thinking about memory as our orientation to experience that makes us who we are. So does anyone have thoughts about that or comments?
Okay, I have something else. So if you believe soul is your identity, and how is an intangible object that doesn't consist of matter dynamic enough to change something that is tangible? Like, how would a soul change if it doesn't have anything to change?
Yeah, great question. Descartes would say the soul doesn't change, the body changes. And insofar as the soul can direct the body, the soul plays a role in changing the body. But as you point out, what is the nature of this intersection, of this connectivity or relationship between soul and body, insofar as one is fundamentally material and the other is immaterial? So think about it this way, and I'm getting a little bit ahead, but you posed the question. So, because we'll talk about this next week. But what do we? So go back to the language of the ghost in the machine, right? So I am a ghost in the machine. The I refers to my soul, which is in the machine, which is the body. So soul is in body, and we talk about that regardless of Descartes. We say, you know, our soul is in our body. When we die, it leaves the body, and so forth. Plato thought of the body as a prison, which incarcerates the soul for the duration of our time on earth. But if Descartes is correct, that body is material, 100%, that is metaphysically foundational in our understanding of what it is. The soul is not. It's the exact opposite. So what is a preposition when we say soul is in body, is in the body? What does a preposition like in refer to? It's a spatial preposition. So coffee is in this cup. And that makes perfect sense. Why? Because both coffee and cup are physical. Coffee can be in a cup. But if I say soul is non-physical, how can it possibly be in a physical thing like a body? What prevents the soul from floating away or from entering your body? What is it exactly that anchors my soul to my body? And as we'll see, Descartes notices a strange ambiguity here. He says, yeah, the soul occupies the body, but not like a sailor occupies a ship. It's different than that, because our souls are more intimately related to our bodies than that analogy suggests. And a sailor can just jump off of a ship. but we can't just decide to jump out of our bodies. So there's a weird ambiguity or tension in Descartes' thinking. But he tried to answer that problem. He said, he tried to locate in the brain a particular seat of connection between soul and body, and he thought that was the pineal gland. So he said, well, there's something about the pineal gland that connects the soul to the body. But why is that ultimately not a good answer? Why doesn't that solve that problem? So why can't I just say, well, it's this little part of the brain that makes it possible for the soul to interchange with the body? Why doesn't that answer the question?
Sorry, could you restate the question?
Yeah, so the mind-body problem is, how is it that an immaterial substance like the soul can be in a physical material substance like the body and even make decisions to direct the body? So when I will to raise my arm, that's a decision of my soul, which then transmits some message to the body, and then I do it. But how is it that something immaterial can relate sufficiently? And I thought this was kind of the question you're asking, Alec. How is it that something that is immaterial can relate sufficiently to something bodily in order to make it do anything? Well, Descartes says, oh, well, there's this little thing in the brain, the pineal gland, and that's what allows this interfacing. But why isn't that a good answer?
Well, if the soul's immaterial, then nothing in your body, no living organism can interact with it. So no matter what kind of signals the soul puts off, nothing can pick up those signals because they're immaterial and they can't be seen, heard, felt, anything.
Yeah, so even the pineal gland, even if it's very small, it's still physical. It's still bodily. So it's irrelevant how small it is. Because smallness of size, we're talking about physical bodies in terms of smallness of size, is still a property that attends specifically to material things. And it can't, if Descartes is correct, if this way we're thinking about the soul is correct, we can't ascribe that kind of seed of connection in terms of the relationship between these phenomena of soul or body. So yeah, we'll talk about that in more detail next time. Yeah, go ahead.
Also, on the topic of the pineal gland, I've read a couple of things, and some people believe that DMT, which your pineal gland releases, has some connection with the soul.
Yeah,
I think that would be interesting to talk about. DMT as a whole,
right.
more or
Yeah,
less.
DMT. Has anybody ever tried DMT? It's a drug you can do. I mean, I won't tell anybody, but
Not yet.
Been used spiritually for decades upon decades in indigenous cultures as, like spiritual ascension. This is something that before it was criminalized, people truly were very passionate about, and that it was a fundamental part of their culture.
Yeah.
And it's definitely an important part to look at. Psychedelics in general when considering the metaphysical, because yeah, it's good.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, it's true. Like, so I had in mind, like there was an ancient Greek mystery cult, which used a particular mushroom, I can't remember the name of it, to engage in these really transformative, spiritual, psychedelic experiences. And when the Romans, so this is after the Hellenic age, when the Romans took over, one of the first things they did was get in the way of those rituals, make them stop doing that. Why? Because it was a means of community making and building as indigenous peoples an understanding of self and togetherness and the beyond, transcendence and so forth. And so instead the Romans took over, made that stop, and then the Greeks just drank wine all the time, which, they drank wine before that anyway, but we can see that kind of thing play out in efforts of of colonialism more recently too. And so, yeah, like looking at the drug war. I mean, there are all sorts of weird issues of social justice involved in that. But yeah, it's a really important and good point that you made, Fia. Yeah, right. There are lots of different, yeah, psilocybin, but there are lots of different types of mushrooms. Mushrooms are fantastic, but yeah, okay. Any other thoughts or
Oh
questions
yeah,
or
also,
comments on this? Yeah, go ahead.
a universal thing with DMT is ego death. Once you take enough anyway.
Mhm.
And it's weird because people who take it have really similar experiences about the same things. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so that is interesting. Just the two things you mentioned, ego death, but similarity of experiences, right? So maybe ego is kind of barrier that prevents more intimate, more fruitful or transformative ways of relating to others and community building, right?
That could also be evidence to the distinction between soul and ego.
Or evidence to like a collective consciousness that there is some type of alternate message that we could theoretically be receptive to if we knew how to raise our souls to that vibrational frequency. Because or well, I guess this is kind of a different topic, but or actually maybe I won't go into that, never mind.
No, that's an important point. But yeah, Tiffany just commented that forests of trees communicate. Absolutely. And they communicate through, since we were just talking about mushrooms, these really intricate mycorrhizal networks, right? So you're talking here about multi-species engagement beyond the level of human identity or self-consciousness, where forests can transmit important messages through these mycorrhizal networks of which they're a part, and they can transmit messages even in the physical sense, chemicals to help ward off potential threats, right? So there's some very interesting things going on beyond our understanding as human beings, as entrenched as we are with our ideas of consciousness and subjectivity and individuality and so forth. So yeah, that's a really good point. And you also ask whether or not they could share a soul, right? That's a great question. And if it is our bodies that are preventing our souls from moving about, and body is then the principle of individuation, maybe when our souls leave our body, are they kept separate? Or perhaps they intermingle in strange ways that we can't even consider right now. Yeah, so great. There's some really excellent questions and comments, and I really appreciate Noel and Amanda, your presentation today. So we're out of time, but so it's not relevant to us, but Monday is our observation of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, our celebration of that, so there's no class then. But I'll see you guys again on Tuesday, and we'll get into Descartes' theory of the soul. So we'll specifically look at Meditations 1 and 2 from his famous work from 1641, Meditations on First Philosophy, because this is the most famous and influential theory in modernity, at least, in the Western intellectual tradition of what a soul is. So we'll talk about that next
I have
week. Yeah.
one thing to impart on the class before we leave.
Sure.
So I'm going to give you guys a weekend to think about, but do some research on psychedelics and see if you can come to a conclusion on whether or not the soul is an individual thing, or rather we all share a soul, or if a soul even exists and rather it's something else. So to shift the definition of the word soul,
Good, yeah. Yeah,
and just kind of think about the correlation between ego and existence outside of yourself.
yeah, good. It's worth noting, just as a final note to build on what Alex said, that the American transcendentalist philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about the oversoul, which human beings share and brings us into concert or affinity with nature, right? And so oversoul draws on this idea of the soul as something kind of at least immaterial, but it isn't egoic. It isn't individualistic as Descartes to some extent seems to push. So very good comment and question, Alec. But yeah, so have a great weekend, guys, and I'll see you next week.
Bye, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.